Well, joining me today is Professor Russell Burke here at Hofstra University. And Dr. Burke, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us and talk to us about one of my favorite topics is coyotes.
Absolutely, sure. I'm happy to do this, and coyotes are certainly one of my favorite topics as well.
Nice.
Fantastic animals.
So is it true we used to have coyotes here on Long Island?
Well, actually, there's no evidence that coyotes were actually here on Long Island. They're mostly a western species. At least when Europeans got here, they were a western species, and were rarely seen, probably almost never seen here at the east. This is wolf territory. This is where there used to be wolves here, and whereas we're used to seeing wolves and coyote together in places in the west, coyotes were very rare here in the east, and there's no real evidence they were ever here on Long Island itself, which complicates the story about how to describe what's going on right now.
Right. Well, I know Yellowstone has been a massive, what do you want to say, experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the coyote population there was very high until the wolves were reintroduced and brought back. And so these canids have always had this tough relationship. Either you have coyotes or wolves in an area. But in Yellowstone, you have both.
That's right.
So we do know they can coexist in the same area, but they're so secretive.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about coyotes is that they're often in places where people don't know they exist, and they can live in places where even around a lot of people, and often people don't even know it because coyotes are extraordinarily adaptable, and they learn very quickly to stay away from where people are and to be hidden and to be secretive. So their success, in part, is due to their ability to be secretive.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're starting to see coyotes coming back to Long Island, and so
yeah, Long Island is an amazing story regarding coyotes because Long Island is the last big chunk of the United States that doesn't have coyotes. Every place else has coyotes, and when I say every place, I mean every place. Chicago has coyotes, Los Angeles has coyotes, Miami has coyotes. So we think about coyotes as being animals of big open green spaces, but they have adapted to living in cities, and New York City is the last major city to be colonized by coyotes. And I say that in part because New York City is the pathway for coyotes to get to Long Island. So Long Island doesn't have coyotes now because, mainly because that bottleneck of New York City. But as New York City gets fully colonized, we're starting to see coyotes trailing into Long Island itself.
So how does that process work then? Because so we were seeing coyotes in all the other major U.S. cities, LA, Chicago, Miami, and so what is the process? What is that called? Habituation or familiarization?
You can call it urbanization.
Urbanization.
So this is a phenomenon that a lot of cities around the world are seeing as some fairly large carnivores, including some that are real surprises, have become urbanized and learned how to live in cities. There are lions that live fairly close to urban centers in Africa, and lions, these great big animals, but they learn how to live around people in some cases. Lots of cities in Europe have had red fox downtown in big cities all over Europe. And in some cities in the United States, we have red fox in the cities. It happens on a case-by-case basis. It's not like the downtown red fox from one city all of a sudden jump to another city. Every city is colonized by their local, non-urban population, and so it happens again and again and again. And so the coyotes that came to New York City, they were not really urban coyotes; they were more like suburban coyotes. They go through that urbanization process, and now as they move out into Long Island, they will become less urban and more suburban, and then maybe a bit more rural as they head further east. So this process that repeats itself again and again, and it's a surprising number of pretty good-sized carnivores are repeating this process in lots of places around the world.
Interesting. It's funny that you mentioned Africa. I was just there in Kenya and stayed in Nairobi. And where we stayed, there was the hotel, a major highway, and Nairobi National Park.
Yeah.
And there was a measly little fence.
Was that not very reassuring?
Separating, lions and rhinos and elephants and all no elephants there, but giraffes and all these things. The giraffe looked like it could step right over the fence.
Sure.
But And they do, I even spoke to some people there, they did have lions coming every once in a while,
Absolutely.
showing up in Nairobi. So it's fascinating that you brought that up. So anyways, so what are we looking at here for Long Island? What's happening right now? I mean, this is a
Sure.
really exciting time, I think, biologically.
It is an amazing time, and there's just a lot happening, and a big part of it is really trying to understand what's happening. Because again, as I said, coyotes are so secretive. They've been successful because they've been able to be under the radar. So what we're trying to do is understand what's going on for an animal that's really secretive. So it's challenging. But New York City has had breeding populations of breeding, a couple of dens of coyotes breeding for several years now, maybe 5 or 7 years, maybe even longer. And they, as has been the pattern other places, the populations come in, they flare up for a little while, they go down, because they get disturbed or whatever, and eventually the population builds up enough that they start sending immigrants further on. And so New York City is clearly producing enough pups, and enough coyotes are coming in through New York City that occasionally they're coming out onto Long Island. We don't have any evidence right now that there are resident coyotes that are lasting long term in Nassau and Suffolk counties, but there have been several coyotes seen in in Suffolk County, and in one case a pair. We don't know that it's a male and female, but at least 2. And mostly they've been out in the east end of Suffolk County, but like I said, several over the last several years. Not sure if it's the same individuals again over and over, or some individuals that were there and died and then were replaced by others. But regardless, we're starting to see those first few immigrants coming into Long Island, and we certainly expect that as their numbers grow, we'll start to see breeding populations, and we'll start to see coyotes more regularly.
Fantastic. As a fellow biologist, I'm completely excited at bringing this on. I mean, I grew up on the eastern plains of Colorado, and I have such fond, childhood memories of sleeping out under the stars, howling with coyotes, and calling for great horned owls and things like that, and waking up to sage grouse calling, things like that. So I'm really excited about that. But I see here on Long Island, there's a completely different reaction that people have when they hear that coyotes could be returning, and I feel like it's one shade away from grabbing your children and your dogs and running inside, and I don't have that reaction at all with coyotes. But it seems that here people have grown up without them, and now the change of having them come seems to be a real point of contention for some people. What would you say to those people?
Well, I would point out that coyotes have been spreading east over much of the United States over the last several decades, and lots of places that did not have coyotes before has had coyote populations go from very low numbers or 0 to high numbers just in the last 50 years. And this has been a nation, eastern United States phenomenon. It's happened over and over and over again. And in every place, people freaked out when this happened. They were very, very, very concerned at first when this happened. And that's, we are afraid of things we don't know about, and when a new animal moves into an area, it's not surprising that lots of people are afraid. And there's no question that coyotes are not harmless. They do occasionally take dogs and cats, and there have been a couple of attacks on humans as well. So they're not harmless by any means. However, it's relatively simple to reduce that risk to a very low level. And I would point out that we live in a world where there are much, much, much greater dangers than the risks that we have from coyotes. There are lots. Every time you cross the street, every time you get into your car, every time we do much of anything, there's some risk. So it's not reasonable to say, can we reduce this risk to 0? Because we're not going to do that ever. However, we can reduce this risk to very, very, very low numbers. One thing, of course, is most of the negative interactions that people have with any wildlife is because they feed them. And so a really important thing is to not put out food for wildlife, not to feed any wild animals, not to try to get them used to you. Let them be wild. Let them leave them alone. Don't train them to be familiar with people. It's bad for people. And it's bad for the wildlife, because most of the times when animals need to be lethally controlled, it's because they became habituated to people. So the most important thing to learn about this is to just let them alone and don't try to feed them. Don't try to make them pets, because they're not pets.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Now, what do you're here at Hofstra, and they're very supportive of your work here.
Sure.
What sort of projects are you and your students working towards?
Well, this is just fascinating. You know, the movement of a large new carnivore into an ecosystem is amazing, and there's opportunities to investigate the effects on a whole variety of other species, and we get to test some basic ideas about how ecosystems work, and especially suburban and urban ecosystems, which we know so little about. And so the coyotes moving in have a lot of interesting implications. And part of what's strange about this is, despite, like I said before, repeated patterns of coyotes moving into areas as they spread east, nobody has really done the kind of work that we're planning to do here. And that is look at how the ecosystems function before the coyotes get there, and then look at how they function after the coyotes there. That's a really long-term project, because it takes a long time to do it, and the movement in is a slow process. But nevertheless, that's what we need to do in order to understand what's happening here. So we're really interested in mapping out things like energy flow and predator-prey relationships among species now, and then we want to keep on doing that as the coyotes come in. And so some of that is just pure research. It's just so that we understand how systems work better. But some of it actually has direct applications, and I'll give you an example. One of my real interests is in understanding the ecology of Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is a fascinating disease. As horrible as it is, it has many, many interesting aspects to it. And one of those things is that we know that white-footed mice are really important players in the Lyme disease story. And one big hypothesis is out there right now that a lot of ecologists are playing with is the idea that red fox control white-footed mouse populations because they prey on white-footed mice very heavily, and that where coyotes move into an area, they prey on or disrupt red fox such that the white-footed mouse population is not hit as hard, and therefore Lyme disease goes up. Now, a lot of people question that. There's a lot of links in that chain that we don't, for which we don't have good support. But one thing we know is that in a lot of cases, coyotes feed on white-footed mice themselves. So they may disrupt red fox from feeding on white-footed mice, but they may pick up on that task themselves. Mm-hmm. So we're very interested in understanding more about red fox diets right now, and then how it will change when the coyotes are there and basically are the predators over top of the red fox. And in some cases, coyotes eat red fox. So they have the possibility of enhancing the white-footed mouse population or decreasing the white-footed mouse population. And we're really interested to see how that plays out across an area where Lyme disease is rampant. Mm-hmm. So we can not only measure the effect on the mice, but also the effect on Lyme disease.
It's almost hard to imagine it getting worse.
It is hard to imagine getting worse. We're in about the worst place in the world for Lyme disease right now. So it's hard to imagine it getting worse. But it might get better. And that's, but we have to have the measuring devices in place so that we can see what changes are going on.
One of the things that you're talking about there is, I know you were talking about the white-footed mice. I'm a little concerned about the high raccoon density that we have here on Long Island, and I've also noticed since I've been here on Long Island, the deer population is marching from Suffolk County well into Nassau County now. Yep. And it just seems to go up and up and up as well. And I know the raccoons are having impacts on our turtle populations because they're eating the eggs. I'm not seeing young turtle recruitment. Right. I'm seeing a lot of older turtles and no young ones. And so there's just this whole multifold effect that these high raccoon and deer populations are having on our ecosystems here on Long Island. What could you predict might happen with a coyote population coming back?
Coyote, we can extrapolate. We can use what we've seen in other places with coyotes to make some predictions about what we're going to see here. Coyotes generally, especially our urban and suburban coyotes, are unlikely to tangle with a raccoon. Raccoons are big, and any dog owner, if your dog has interacted with a coyote, with a raccoon, you know that raccoons are very capable of defending themselves.
I saw firsthand a red fox and a raccoon tangle,
mixing it up.
And the raccoon walked away.
Right, and any vet can tell you that they have seen dogs brought in some cases big dogs brought in to their clinic that have tangled with a raccoon, and it's not a pretty sight.
Wow.
Raccoons usually will convince any dog and any coyote to leave them alone because they're formidable. And so generally, people who look at diet studies of coyotes, they see very little evidence that they're predating on raccoons. Now, there's a couple caveats to that. One is there's at least one study that showed in an isolated case, coyotes ate a lot of raccoons in one place. And that was here in the Northeast. So there's some hints that there might be possible. And the other thing is that coyotes, like other carnivores, can affect other species indirectly as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that coyotes have to feed on raccoons to make an effect. The very presence of coyotes can deter raccoons from foraging in places. So a friend of mine who works on a diamondback terrapin site up in Massachusetts, where there are lots of coyotes, told me about the fact that the coyotes are always on his property and the terrapins nest perfectly well, and predation rates are very, very low. However, one year, one of his neighbors shot the coyotes because they're game species, and you could do that. And that year, the raccoons hammered the turtle populations. And then a new batch of coyotes moved in, and the predation by the raccoons went way down again. So it's not necessarily that the coyotes are feeding on the raccoons, it's just the raccoons are afraid of the coyotes and are less willing to be out in the open places a long distance from trees when there are coyotes in the area. So, they don't want to be harassed by the coyotes. So it's possible then even in the absence of direct predation, the coyotes might have an effect on raccoon activities, maybe not raccoon numbers, but raccoon activities. And you mentioned the Yellowstone example a few minutes ago. We know that, for example, the wolves have a much bigger effect on the elk than they do through direct predation. They affect where the elk feed, not simply because they're eating the elk, but because the elk are scared to go into places where they're really vulnerable. Same thing might be true with coyotes and raccoons. That's something that we certainly hope to look at while we're here. You also mentioned deer. So we do know, of course, that coyotes do predate heavily on deer in some places, mostly on fawns, because fawns are much easier for them to take than adults. But in some places in upstate New York, for example, where there's big forests, big patches of forest, lots and lots of deer, coyotes in those areas adapt to hunting in packs, and they definitely take down deer from time to time. It's a lot of work, but they act more like wolves than like coyotes. Now, I don't think we're going to see that here. We don't have those kinds of forest expanses here. But if the coyotes have any effect on deer, I suspect it's going to be through fawn predation. And the question is really not whether they'll take them, because they probably will, but it's more likely that they'll reduce, they may take enough that it may reduce the number of fawns that grow up to adulthood. So whether that will affect the population size or not, I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there anything else you'd like to say about coyotes? Or
I think the coyotes are partially interesting because they are a whole new category all by themselves. For example, they're not coming back to Long Island because they weren't really here before. And they're not non-native in the sense that, they are United States native. So in a sense, they are native species that were never native here. And it's almost like we need a new term to explain this. It's a new term to describe them. In addition to that, the coyotes that we have that are coming to here are different from the coyotes that evolved in the West. They're genetically different. They've gone through these. They certainly have some gene input from wolves. They certainly have some gene input from domestic dogs, and they are different in a lot of ways from the natural coyote. So some people have argued that we're basically talking about a new species here. I wouldn't go that far, but we're definitely talking about an animal that's different than we have ever seen before.
So getting back to invasive, native, non-native issues, like where is that balance of these things? These terms seem to be thrown out, but it's always in in my mind at least, a static bubble. And,
right.
And to me, environments are not in a static bubble. Ecology is something that's always in flux.
Right.
And so, how do you address those topics?
Yeah, I think we tend to try to come up with like rigid definitions for things, and unfortunately, in the living world, the living world doesn't like rigid definitions. It moves around those boundaries a lot, and so we might say that some species is non-native if we bring it somewhere, either on purpose or by accident. But if it gets there on its own, well, then that's natural. And from the species point of view, they don't care whether some human brought them or whether they got there on their own. What they care about is that they got there. From our point of view, I think it makes sense to say, what species do we want and what species do we not want? So, we might not want lots of plants, but we sure like corn. We might not want lots of invasive species that we bring across, but we want corn and wheat and all the other species that we move around. Mm-hmm. So it's more a question of desirability than it is it native or non-native. I like lots of species that are very rare. I find them desirable simply because I don't want to lose anything. I don't want them to go extinct. So from my point of view, they're desirable. But that doesn't mean and I want them to live in their natural environment. But somebody else might feel differently. That's certainly the case. So people feel differently about those things. Coyotes are probably not native in the usual sense to Long Island, but we did used to have a big canid carnivore, right? Mm-hmm. And so nobody's going to advocate we bring wolves back. Well, that's probably not true that nobody would, but few people would argue we should bring wolves back, and I would argue that they wouldn't be sustainable on Long Island. Right. But we could have the ecological equivalent or something like the ecological equivalent of wolves with coyotes. So they could do some of the things that wolves used to do. Long Island used to have bears. Nobody's going to argue that we should bring bears back. But these species used to be here. They're not here anymore. We make decisions about what we want here or not. Now, on the other hand, yet another way to look at it is we could decide we don't want coyotes. It won't change things much. Coyotes are going to get here anyway. It would take a full-out, concerted, long-term, dedicated effort going continuously to keep coyotes out. And I don't think anybody's up to that. So given that fact, given the fact that coyotes have shown again and again and again and again, they're remarkably resilient, very, very persistent, very adaptable, we're going to have coyotes. So really, it's up to us to think ahead and adapt to that. And we can do so with very little effort on our part. And we can even welcome them from the point of view that they're going to fulfill some of the role of that large canid carnivore that we used to have.
That'd be great.
Right.
I can't wait to welcome them back.
Well, coyotes are also different because, as you were mentioning earlier, we interact with them vocally. And most wildlife, nobody listens for raccoons, nobody listens for deer, nobody listens. The only other animals that we listen for that we interact with sound are birds, right? And people know lots and lots of bird calls. But you can walk out in the woods at night and all you're going to hear is owls in terms of animals. That's going to change. I do a lot of work in New Jersey and I'm out at night and I hear coyotes, and that's coyotes and owls, and sometimes frogs, are all you hear. And adding another animal to that nighttime sound is pretty cool.
Absolutely.
And you can sing to them, and they sing back.
Yes, they do.
That's a lot of fun. Owls will do that too. Birds, frogs, not so much.
Yep.
Yeah.
How are these coyotes getting onto Long Island? we are an island.
That's right.
And
That's right.
so if they're swimming or they have an Uber or a Lyft or something. So how do we know how they're getting on?
It's those late night trains. People just don't look very carefully, and that's a coyote on there with you. Coyotes are extraordinarily adaptable and flexible, and they try things. And so they do swim. Although they're not extraordinary swimmers, they're good swimmers. But they move around a lot, they explore their habitat, and especially young animals, after they leave the den, strike out on their own. And of course, most of those attempts fail, but every now and then they try something that works. We don't know from having watched an individual come onto Long Island how they're doing it. They're certainly coming through New York City. They're not swimming the Sound. It's very unlikely they're swimming the Sound. So they're certainly coming through New York City. Which bridge they're taking, which tunnel they're taking, or whatever, I don't know. But they're definitely in Queens. From Queens, it's not a bridge. It's pretty easy from there. So they're definitely getting to that part of the city. I don't know. Probably one of the bridges. Certainly, other animals use bridges pretty readily. Raccoons cross bridges, possums cross bridges, cats cross bridges. Very likely, coyotes cross bridges as well. They're doing it late at night. Coyotes, urban coyotes in particular, are active very, very, very late at night, and crossing bridges is just not that hard to imagine.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, so what got you involved in studying coyotes out of all the wonderful species that are out there? And I know you dabble with a lot of other species too. But what is your fascination or interest? What got you started with coyotes?
I think of myself mostly as a community ecologist. So I'm interested in the interactions between different species, not just one species, but how one species affects another. And most of my life I've worked on reptiles, and mostly turtles, but other reptiles as well. But through a weird set of events, I got involved with some Lyme disease projects. And Lyme disease in other parts of the country often involves the presence or absence of lizards. And so my lizard work got me into that part. And then as that work developed, I started thinking about what controls Lyme disease here in the Northeast. And of course, a large part of that is white-footed mice. And my community ecology antenna went up when I realized that we had a major new carnivore moving in, and that major new carnivore could have a trickle-down effect on white-footed mice. So that part got my attention. I was really very interested in that. And then, of course, what an opportunity. We're the last place in the United States to do this set of experiments.
Wow.
And it's also, it's a set of experiments that everybody involved at this stage is going to pass on to the next generation, because it will blossom in 20, 30 years. So the work we do now is going to lay the foundation for conclusions that will be drawn in a couple of decades. So, who's going to say no to that? That's just way too much fun.
That is.
It's very exciting to be able to pass that on. So we're really interested in collecting the baseline data now and setting up long-term study plots that later will turn out to be, answer some of these questions about coyotes.
Right. Now, you mentioned baseline data, and I'm involved with a lot of different community conservation projects, and people want to help.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interested people. Is there something set up yet that if somebody sees something, they could report it? Absolutely.
There's a website already set up where you can report any carnivore, anything you see that looks weird. So it's set up primarily. I mean, our take on it is it's set up to identify to report coyotes, but it's also set up to report red fox, which of course we know are common on Long Island, gray fox, otter, all the interesting, especially interesting animals on Long Island. This is a DEC website. It's also set up by the Gotham Coyote people as well. And I'm sure we can show the website address at the end of this.
Absolutely.
Sure. And so anybody who sees something they think might be a coyote is encouraged to take pictures, of course, and send them to us. Most of what we know about coyotes on Long Island, maybe all of what we know about coyotes in Nassau and Suffolk, comes from citizens sending in pictures. Sometimes it's wildlife cameras. Sometimes it's somebody seeing something in their backyard and taking pictures. 99% of what people send us are red fox. But that's okay. We will take 99 red fox for the 1 coyote.
And do you want that sent to you or
No, to the
that
website. To the website, absolutely to the website.
And you have access to that data?
Absolutely, sure, we do. So we're really, really interested in people reporting them. You know, we can't have the eyes and ears out there that we would really need to do this right. So people out there, you know, taking pictures of what they see is critical. You know, it's the general public that are going to tell us what's out there. I can't be in the right place at the right time unless somebody tells us where it is.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
It's really good seeing you again, and thanks for having a chat with me today.
Absolutely. This has been lots of fun. Always happy to talk about coyotes.
That's great, man.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much.
Sure.